Welcome to VS Live. My name's Alvin Ashcraft. In this session, we'll be going through the different UI frameworks available for building Windows native apps. And there's a lot of options out there today, so we'll be touching on most of them, all the ones from Microsoft that use .NET, and then we'll mention some of the others as we go too. So the survey, remember to do your survey. It's important to the organizers of the event and to the speakers as well. Helps us improve our sessions. A little bit about me. If you don't know me, I've been working in the software industry since the mid-90s. Most of that time, over 25 years, I was a software developer working with different Microsoft technologies. Started out with Visual Basic, moved into .NET when that came out. Spent a lot of years doing WPF development for Windows. And then a few years ago, I started doing some writing, wrote a couple of books. And about 2.5 years ago, I joined Microsoft full-time as a content developer, writing docs on the Windows Developer Docs team, do documentation, samples, training modules. Like I said, I wrote a couple of books mentioned up there, Learn WinUI 3 and a parallel programming book for .NET. And on the side, I do a little bit of conference organizing myself, Tech Bash Developer Conference. Been working on that since 2016, and our next one is coming up next month now, the end of next month. Right. Oh, I also wanted to mention that I have another session on Thursday if you're interested in the Microsoft Learn stuff. It's a fast focus session about doing PRs and issues, how you can contribute yourself to the docs. So today's agenda will be looking at a brief history of Windows development to start out. We'll look at the choices available to .NET developers today. We'll touch on some pros and cons of each. We'll look at Windows Forms, WPF. UWP we'll touch on briefly. It's not going to be around for the long term, but there's still some existing stuff out there that you can use. WinUI and the Windows App SDK. We'll look at .NET MAUI, although that's not just a Windows native solution. You can build Windows apps with that. And then we'll take a look at Uno platform, Avalonia, and Blazor hybrid apps. At the end there, we'll get some guidelines for how you can choose the best one, and we'll have some links, some resources, and some Q&A. So the history with .NET desktop app development. So WinForms has been there every step of the way with .NET. And even before WinForms and .NET, Microsoft had a similar visual form designer with VB. It was back in 1991 that Bill Gates demoed their first form designer for Visual Basic. I've got a link to that. You can get all my slides up on my GitHub repo. I'll mention that at the end on the slide. WPF was next. That came out in 2006. It's a XAML-based UI framework. Became a big deal for enterprise and still is. Enterprises still use WPF extensively today. Became the de facto choice for many of those businesses after a couple years after its introduction. I'm skipping over the Windows 8 XAML apps, but the next thing to come out was in 2015. With Windows 10, we got UWP apps, the Universal Windows Platform. And with UWP, you could use the same code base to build for any of the Windows platforms. So Windows desktops, the Surface tablets, Windows Phone at the time, Xbox, HoloLens. You could target all of those with UWP. They never had big success getting the enterprise developers into UWP. They kind of stuck with WPF, but it got some traction with ISVs building consumer apps. In fact, WhatsApp just maybe 1.5 years ago released a new version of their Windows app that's built on UWP. I believe they're looking into WinUI for that in the future. Next in 2021, we had a couple of releases. There was in the spring, WinUI and Windows App SDK came out in March. And that's the successor to UWP. It's very similar to UWP in many ways. The namespaces are a bit different, but most of the controls and the XAML syntax, it's all the same. And Blazor Hybrid apps also came out then, and they give you a way to build with Razor Pages and C# code and host that within either a Maui app, or you can also do it with WPF and with WinForms. So you can have a Blazor Hybrid app within a WinForms app. And then we'll also talk about Maui. That came out a year later in 2022. So Maui, that's the successor to Xamarin Forms. You can build iOS, Android, Windows apps. You can build Mac OS, and even Samsung Tizen devices, TVs, and watches. And if we have some time at the end, we'll also look at, mostly look at Uno, but Avalonia does a similar thing with Uno. It gives you all the platforms that you get with Maui, but you can also deploy your apps to Linux and to the web with WebAssembly. So you have one code base and you go out to all those platforms. The main difference between those two, Avalonia and Uno is the WinUI syntax for the XAML, and Avalonia uses WPF. If we have more time, we could talk about some third-party things. There's Flutter, React Native, Electron apps. You can do all those to build Windows. So a few examples of different UIs, what you might get with each of the platforms. The first one there in the upper corner is WinForms. Probably looks familiar to most people. It's got that classic Windows app style. Below that is also WinForms, though. That's styled with some third-party control. I think that one's a DevExpress theme on there. The one in the center, that's Visual Studio. I don't know if everybody knows, but Visual Studio's UI is mostly WPF. They still have a few legacy dialogues, but for the most part, it's WPF now. And the one below that in the center, that's .NET Maui demo. So that demo app is up on GitHub. It's a weather sample app. It responds to different mobile app sizes. You can see that it's got Windows, it's got iOS and Android there. You can get the source code for that on GitHub. Just search for .NET Maui weather sample, and that'll come up. The top right there, that's the file explorer in Windows 11, which is now using WinUI 3. So the latest builds of Windows 11, I think it's almost a year now, maybe 9 months or so that the file explorer has been available with WinUI. Microsoft and some of the key partners, Apple and Adobe, have been using WinUI to build a lot of the new apps. You can see there on the bottom, that's the Apple Music app, which is built with WinUI 3. And Apple also recently released a couple other of their apps with WinUI. I believe it's the Apple Devices app for connecting your Apple device, and the Apple TV app is also WinUI. So let's start with some details of each framework, and we'll start out with Windows Forms. So WinForms is probably still the most used Windows framework when it comes to starting a new project. A lot of people just do file new project, WinForms, to test something quick and dirty. Developers love WinForms because it lets you build apps quickly. It's got that drag and drop designer. You can drag a few text boxes and buttons onto a form and test some code. Everything you do on there, you can do with C# or still VB. You can create a VB WinForms project. There's no separate language or markup to learn for the UI. It's all just .NET code under the hood. We saw in the previous slide, there's been a strong third-party support for WinForms for a long time now. So there are lots of control vendors, themes that you can get. So when you create a new WinForms project, you've got two options right now. You can create the new .NET 8 WinForms project, or you can still go back and create a .NET Framework project with WinForms if you need to support some older unsupported operating systems, Windows 7. You can go back and do that with the .NET Framework. And if you have existing .NET Framework WinForms apps that you'd like to modernize, there's a .NET upgrade tool that you can use. You can load your .NET Framework WinForms app into that, and it will output the .NET 8 app and give you a list of any issues that were encountered along the way. Most of those will be along the lines of third-party controls and things that don't have equivalents. And that tool can also work on other UI frameworks. WPF, it works for upgrading from .NET Framework. You can use it for going from Xamarin Forms to .NET MAUI, or to go from UWP to WinUI. You can run it through that too. Windows Forms is still actively developed. You can see they have a GitHub roadmap where you can go and see what's coming up in the next releases. Because there's no XAML, CSS, or other UI language to learn, every .NET developer can be a WinForms developer. A few drawbacks, and then we'll do a quick demo. So without any custom theming applied, WinForms kind of looks a little bit dated. I had some updates to improve the UI over the years. It doesn't look exactly like it did with .NET Framework, but it still has that WinFormy look to it. It's not going to be getting any Fluent Design, the Windows 11 style anytime soon. The XAML-based frameworks can also take advantage of GPU acceleration to get better performance of the UI. There's no C++ language support. If you're a C++ developer, you can't do WinForms. Let's see, there's no built-in support for switching between light and dark themes yet. I imagine that'll be coming someday, but as of today, you can't automatically switch when somebody switches their theme in Windows. And if you're doing a lot of touch or pen input, there are things you can do with controls, but it's not the best framework of choice for doing touch and pen input. It wasn't really built for that. All right, so let's stop the slideshow for a minute and look at some code. So in this solution, I've got a whole bunch of projects that we'll be looking at as we go through the different frameworks. My WinForms project is the first one we'll be looking at. So each one of these is a very simple shopping app. I built the same kind of UI for each one. And most of them share this shared project. They have a project reference to it. All of them except the UWP project, which can't reference .NET 8. So in the shared project, we've got an item and a category. And then I've got some helper methods that just build some dummy data to load into the forms for us. So let's look at the designer for the WinForms app here. So it's just got a couple of controls at the top to pick a category, put a name in, and add item, and it'll populate the grid if you add the item. And this is using some data binding. You can see the code behind for this. Take that out. So I've got a list of items, list of categories, and I'm calling the helper to create the categories, binding my data source here to the grid view on the UI. And I've got some logic in the add, the clear, and if you click a cell. So it allows you to remove. Let's just run this. So it's a pretty classic WinForms example. Add some produce, I'll add a kiwi. Click add, it gets added to the grid through the data binding. And I can mark things as purchased. I can delete rows. Pretty simple. And we'll see how this UI changes as we look at the different frameworks. All right, let's switch back to extend. So next up is WPF. So WPF has a XAML-based UI. If you're not familiar with XAML, it's a schema-bound XML markup language. It's got support for data binding, styles, loading static and dynamic resources. Visual Studio provides a UI designer for WPF. Also has hot reload. If you were in the last session on .NET MAUI, you saw how the the hot reload works, where you can just make a change while the app's running, and you'll see it immediately in the UI that you're debugging. Let's see, as I mentioned on the WinForm slide, the XAML-based UIs are GPU accelerated, which means that they're rendered in the DirectX pipeline, and you get additional performance, UI rendering performance. It offloads work from the CPU to the GPU. The data binding in WPF is extremely powerful. It lends itself to the model view model pattern, or MVVM. Visual Studio has tools for debugging data binding errors. So when you're running the app, there's a bindings error window where you can see any issues with your bindings. You used to have to filter through your output to find those. Like WinForms, WPF has .NET 8 and .NET Framework support. So you can target older operating systems if you need to. It's got extensive third-party control support. And it's under active development. They've got some big releases coming out this year with .NET 9. So if you check out the roadmap on GitHub, you'll see what's coming up. The big thing is the Windows 11 theming support. It's a complete UI refresh that we'll see in the demo in a second. We'll load up a .NET 8 and the .NET 9 version of the app and see the difference there. And WPF is the framework of choice for many companies building business apps today. It's still the best XAML framework when you're working with multi-window applications. It's not really possible with UWP, and with WinUI, it's still, you can do some multi-window stuff, but it's a little bit tricky still. Let's look at the drawbacks. So the primary downside is the XAML learning curve. If people aren't familiar with XAML, they don't really like XAML, that can be the biggest turnoff to some folks. I love working with XAML. It's not everyone's favorite. Like WinForms, it's C# and VB only. There's no C++. If you're a big F# fan, there are some ways that you can make that work. You can create a minimal UI project and then do some F# in your view models in a separate project. The Windows theming and dark mode switching, it's on the way, but coming very soon, this fall with .NET 9, and I'll have to remove this bullet point here from the cons pretty soon. It's got better touch and pen than WinForms, but it's still not the best. It wasn't really built with that in mind. You'd have to do some resizing to make some of the buttons and controls a little more touchable. And performance-wise, it's much better with .NET 8 and .NET 9. Got the improvements coming with the ahead of time compiling. That'll help with performance even more in .NET 9. Let's see, so let's look at that sample app next. All right. Close that up. Let's set our .NET 8 as the startup. So both of these WPF solutions are also referencing the same shared project. They have a project reference to that. And the XAML and the code behind are exactly the same for both of them, except for one little difference in the app.xaml that I'll show you. Let's zoom this a bit. So you can see in the designer, it looks a little bit more modern than WinForms. And then the XAML code for this, it's not the prettiest stuff. If you're familiar with XAML, you probably recognize how this is working here. It's got a stack panel at the top for the top set of controls, the labeled combo box, text box. And then I'm using a data grid with data binding for the list. And the code behind it's kind of similar to the WinForms. We've got our collections. We're calling the helpers to get the data. And then we've got buttons for adding, deleting. Save is not implemented, but we have a button there for that. And there's a clear method to clear out the fields. And let's look at the .NET 9 difference real quick before we run both of these. So this is the one change that you currently have to make with the preview of .NET 9. You just have to add this resource dictionary into your app.xaml. And let's see here. It's just importing this fluent XAML set of styles. So let's start and run the WPF 8 and see how that looks. So a little bit more modern than WinForms. It's got all the same functionality. Hit a drop down, add some sour cream to our list. We can delete rows, we can mark them as purchased. And none of this is persisting. Like you saw, the save button is not implemented. It's just loading dummy data. Now let's see the difference with the .NET 9 WPF. Run that. And since the XAML is exactly the same and the sizes of things are a bit different, it doesn't look perfect. The labels aren't aligned quite right, but that's easy enough to tweak those things. It has the bigger kind of look. It looks a little bit more like WinUI and other Fluent theme things in Windows 11. Add sour cream to this one. And I put it at the bottom of my list. Check boxes, delete items, and everything functions just the same. Okay. Let's go back. Okay, UWP advantages with an asterisk. So we'll briefly talk about UWP apps next. We'll touch on the advantages, but the drawbacks on the next slide should probably weigh a bit heavier on your decision. Thanks to Windows Phone, UWP apps are optimized for performance. People building for phones are very concerned about memory consumption, performance, everything had to be fast. So they're small, memory optimized with the .NET native runtime. It technically supports HoloLens and Xbox, but the HoloLens is now officially deprecated, and I haven't heard a lot of people building for Xbox lately. So like WPF, there's a XAML designer for UWP, so it's a little bit easier to get started. You don't have to know XAML as much. You can click and drag your things around, even if the generated XAML isn't always the best when you use the designer. The UWP apps were built for pen and touch support. They had that in mind with tablets and phones, so it's got great support for that out of the box. Like all the XAML languages, it's got data binding and testability with MVVM. And the WinUI 2 libraries, not to be confused with WinUI 3 and the App SDK, WinUI 2 libraries provide some additional controls that some of them do have some Fluent design support, and they have additional helpers and styles that help you make a little bit nicer UWP app. And the last bullet there, the sandboxing. So UWP apps are sandboxed, which means that they have limited access to the file system and other Windows resources, so they can be more secure by default, protect the other apps on your system, provides additional security from bad actors. Like mobile apps, they need to declare any of the advanced capabilities. If they want more file system access, that has to be declared. And then when you download them from the Microsoft Store, you'll see what extra capabilities that these apps have, and you can decide to install it or not based on that. And so the security and sandboxing is UWP specific, but there's something called App Silo coming out later this year that will allow you to take any packaged desktop app and give it the same kind of sandboxing. Okay. UWP drawbacks. So the downside of building UWP apps, unless you have a good reason, I don't recommend starting a new UWP project today. There's going to be no more feature updates coming. From here on out, it's bug fixes and security updates only. There's also going to be no new features coming to the WinUI 2 libraries. Those are only getting bug fixes, security updates. It should be supported by Microsoft for a time yet, but there's nothing been announced about deprecation, but that will eventually be coming down the road. And while the .NET Native is small and fast, gives you great performance, that's also aging. With UWP, you don't get access to modern .NET or the features that come along with that. So you can't officially use any C# features beyond what was in C# 7. So we're up to C# 12 now. That's pretty many versions of features that you're not getting with UWP. It requires some workarounds to use some of the features, and it's not always worth it if you end up breaking something in your app. While WinUI 2 gives you some fluent design on some of the controls, it's Fluent 1.0, which is more the Windows 10 look and feel. The latest Windows 11 Fluent design is called Fluent 2. So you get that with WinUI, and you'll get some of that with the refresh to WPF. Another big drawback is UWP relies on .NET Standard for its shared libraries. And so when you're consuming NuGet packages, Microsoft has kind of been moving away from .NET Standard. It's more .NET itself is the standard. It's all cross-platform now, so there's not really a need to have the separate .NET Standard. In fact, the MSAL, the Microsoft Authentication Libraries, recently announced that they're no longer going to be supporting any .NET Standard with their upcoming versions. So that means no new features for UWP with MSAL libraries. MSAL is also dropping their Xamarin support going forward. Finally, UWP versions are tied to the Windows SDK versions. So even before the kind of end of new feature support, you had to wait for a new version of Windows with a new SDK to get any new features into your UWP apps. And it also means if you're targeting a specific version of the SDK, anybody in an older version can't use it. Okay, let's take a look at what the UWP app looks like. Set that as startup. So the one difference in UWP compared to all the other projects is it can't reference that shared project because it's .NET 8. So what I did as a workaround was I have those same 3 files in this project, but they're just referencing those files. So it's the same files here. But the downside of doing it that way is instead of creating a copy, if I make any .NET 8 C# features in these files, it's going to break the compilation of my UWP project. So I used pretty simple syntax. I have each new, it's more verbose than it would be if I were using the latest C#. Okay. So the main page, it looks similar to the others, but it's more UWP looking. It's kind of got that Windows 10 look to it, kind of modern, but very squared off. Windows 11 is more about the rounded corners now. Let's run this guy and take a look at how that looks running. And then we can take a quick look at the XAML and the code behind, but it's very similar to the WPF. Did that not run? So it's because I can't see my, there we go. So that's a little more modern looking. It gets a little bit of animations when the things pop open. Add, let's see, pork. I already have pork. Let's do pork loin. Kind of fades in when you add a new item. When I hit delete on one of these, it kind of slides things up. Looks a little bit nicer. So we're getting a little bit better with the way things look, a little bit more modern. And like WPF, it's got the stack panel with my items across the top. I'm using a list view with data binding again. And within the list view, I have a template for the header and then a template for each item. And in the code behind, again, I have my items, my categories. I'm using an observable collection here, which means that any updates I make in the code here will get reflected on the UI. It'll notify the UI of any items added or removed. Got add and delete button actions and clearing the entry fields when I add an item. Right. Let's resume. Okay. Next up is WinUI. So WinUI or WinUI 3, it's the UI component of the Windows App SDK. It's technically called WinUI 3, but with WinUI 2 becoming legacy, the product team has started to just refer to it as WinUI, shorten things. Which means I may have to do another edition of my book, Learn WinUI 3, to drop the 3. The first edition was misprinted with WinUI 3.0, so we fixed that in the second edition. It does support the latest Fluent design concepts, the Windows 11 look and feel in Fluent 2. So it'll match all the other apps that are running in Windows, all the built-in apps, all the third-party apps that are coming out from Apple and Adobe. You'll get the features and controls of UWP without being coupled to a specific version of the Windows SDK. So the Windows App SDK updates multiple times a year. 1.5 came out recently, and 1.6 is due out, I think, the end of this month. So besides WinUI in the Windows App SDK, there are things like notification support. There's multi-window support for WinUI with an app window control. There's media controls now. The most recent 1.5 release that came out brought the new maps control, which was a big gap between UWP and WinUI. It was missing maps control, and media controls came later, but those are all there now. And that was one of the top requested features, was the map. 1.6, which is next up, it's going to lay the groundwork for some new features in 1.7, including inking controls, a table view control, cross-process platform islands, which is like if you've used the interop between WPF and WinForms, this content islands is similar for doing WinUI with other platforms. Right now, it's a little bit complicated to use. It's C++ only at this point, so in the future, they'll be coming out with more for that that'll make it more consumer friendly. And the big thing that's coming, if you were in James's previous session, he talked about the native AOT coming to Maui. That's also coming to WinUI, which will give you the performance benefits that we see in UWP with the smaller assemblies. So it's a smaller memory footprint, faster compilation, faster startup time. Get to see some other features on the roadmap on the next slide. If you check out that link there, you can also see all the upcoming stuff on the WinUI team's roadmap. let's see, and a few other things. It's great for data binding with MVVM, just like all the other XAML frameworks. The C# and C++ support is available on multiple processor architectures. They have ARM64 support now. You can upgrade UWP apps with the .NET Upgrade Assistant. You can also get lots of free controls and components with the Windows Community Toolkit and the .NET Community Toolkit. You can read more about leveraging both of those in my book. The .NET Community Toolkit has a nice MVVM toolkit that makes your view models very slim. Does a lot of the stuff behind the scenes for you. And finally, Microsoft is really positioning this as their hero framework. So they're working closely with some of the partners like Apple and Adobe to release these apps to show what WinUI can do. They're really pushing this as the next big thing. This and WPF, really. So some drawbacks, and then we'll look at a demo. So it's currently really the best option, but there are some drawbacks. The biggest one for most people that aren't crazy about XAML is the lack of a XAML designer in Visual Studio. You have to do all your XAML coding by hand. It's been the top request on GitHub issues since it came out. The product team is very aware that it's wanted, so I assume it'll come at some point, but it's something that they need to do in conjunction with the Visual Studio team. The Visual Studio team writes those designers, so it needs to be a joint effort. I think they could probably satisfy a lot of people if they started with a read-only designer, just something that you could see what was being built as you're handwriting your XAML. Another thing, you get no F#, no Visual Basic support. It's only C# and C++. You could create a minimal UI project if you really wanted to use one of those other languages, put all your view models and your business logic in a separate project. And if you're porting something from UWP, you're going to lose your Xbox and HoloLens support if you had that. And WinUI is currently Windows desktop only unless you're using something like Uno Platform to take it to other platforms. And another big request up on GitHub is the data validation. So being able to have a validation logic that puts those little red indicators in the UI automatically if you didn't fill out a field correctly. So that's not built in yet, but it's something we had with UWP, and I think they'll get to it at some point. There was some initial code in there in some of the 1.0 previews of App SDK, and there are some ways that you can work around it. I've got one in my book where you can build your own validation. There's just a base class that you need to add to your view model. It's pretty simple to do. All right, so let's look at this project. Okay. So the WinUI, excuse me, so a little bit different than some of the others. So I added a view model here instead of binding to things in the code behind, but it's referencing the same shared project for the model stuff. If we open up the view model, I'm using the MVVM toolkit here. So to do that, if you inherit from an observable object from the toolkit and you make your view model class a partial class, then all you need to do to make your properties data bindable is to add this observable property attribute. So you only have to declare your private members, and then the public getters and setters, those all get generated behind the scenes for you. And you can add some extra attributes if you want to specify a command that will trigger can execute change for. So if you want to say, I want to only enable this add command if something's been put into the item name, then every time this item name changes, it's going to check if that command should be enabled or not. So I put that on both the category and the name. So when either one of those changes, if they're both populated, then the command will get enabled. You'll be able to hit the add button. So here's the other end of that, the add method. I just have to put an attribute on there to generate the command for that. And then the can add item is what gets executed when those properties change. And that's just checking if we have a name and category is not null. So as far as the code behind now, I left the delete button stuff in here, but all it's doing is creating a new view model, and we're binding to that item in the view. So here's the view. You can see no designer loaded up. This is all just XAML that we're looking at. And it is similar to the UWP XAML. The syntax for both UWP and WinUI is about the same. So you've got stack panels and all your controls for the top controls, list view with the exact same kind of header template and item template, defining what each one of those looks like, and the save button at the bottom. So let's run this, switch this to the WinUI. And there we are. It looks a lot like the UWP, but things are a little bit more rounded. We've got rounded corners on our buttons and checkboxes and combo box. So we'll add a frozen item, add some peas. Those are now at the bottom of my list, and I can check boxes. I can delete items. Oops, I have some problem in my logic where it's deleting the next one. But anyway, you get those nice little animations. And you get all that styling without any changes to your XAML. That's all just the built-in styles. Right. Okay. Back to the deck. .NET MAUI. So if you were in James's session before this, you probably know most of this, but .NET MAUI, cross-platform. So you can do Windows, and when it creates Windows, it's WinUI. So if you're thinking about targeting Windows and other platforms, .NET MAUI is probably the best choice out of the box. It's the successor to Xamarin Forms. If you're familiar with Xamarin Forms, you'll be able to get up to speed on MAUI in no time. So it can be deployed to Windows, Android, iOS, macOS, Samsung Tizen devices, watches, TVs. Linux is not available for Microsoft. There are some community efforts to try and get that going. And it's requested quite a bit, but I don't know if there's a lot of companies out there asking for it, or if it's just developers that would like to play with it. So with MAUI, you get a single code base, and you target all those platforms. You can create platform-specific code if there's things that you only wanted to do on Android or iOS, or they work differently on Android and iOS. You have your platform-specific code for those things. It's got helpers to wrap many of those things, device functions like accessing the file system, camera, location. Those are different on different platforms, but MAUI's got wrappers for those, so you only need to do one thing in your code. You can create platform-specific UI blocks. So you can, in your XAML, use this on-platform markup extension to say on-platform Android, I want to have these controls. On-platform iOS, I want to have these other controls. So if you build other XAML apps, .NET MAUI is pretty simple. The layout, styling, and bindings are all similar. But MAUI does support CSS. Bindings also, if you like CSS, you're a web developer. Some controls have slightly different names between MAUI and the other XAML frameworks, but it supports MVVM just like all the others. And you can also create your whole UI in C# if you like. So if you use the .NET Community Toolkit and something called C# markup, you can declare your entire UI in your C# code, kind of similar how Flutter does theirs. So when a Maui app is compiled and deployed to Windows, it's creating a WinUI app under the covers. So the Maui team is dependent on the WinUI team for any of the features and controls that'll run when the Windows app goes. So that maps control coming out in 1.5 helps the Maui team out. Now they can have a maps control that works across all their platforms too. When you're building Maui apps, you can use Visual Studio or VS Code on Windows. On Mac OS and Linux, you can build apps with VS Code. VS for Mac used to be a thing on Mac OS, but that's no longer supported. There's also the Blazor hybrid app template for .NET Maui that allows you to build your UI with Razor Pages and C# and run it within the Maui app. There's a session on, I think, the hybrid apps on Thursday, James said, with Sam Basu, where he does a lot of cool things with different types of Blazor hybrid apps in Maui. He does it with Blazor. He also does it with Angular app, where he has .NET code executing and rendering within your Angular app. It's very cool stuff. And we'll also show a Blazor hybrid app in a few minutes, but one that's running in a WPF shell. Drawbacks, no major drawbacks with Maui. The platform-specific code can be an issue for some people if you don't like writing whole different bits of code for the different platforms, but it's better than writing entirely different apps for different platforms. Like WinUI, there's no XAML designer, but they do have that nice kind of read-only view, which is more than WinUI has. It's got the hot reload like WinUI has, so you can run your app and make changes. Maui is C# only right now. No official support for VB, F# or C++. You could use F# and a Blazor hybrid app for Maui in your Razor components. So today, most people that are using Maui are doing it for Android and iOS, not as many for Windows. So if you're heavy on the Windows platform, those features aren't always high on the request list. If there's things that are needed for iOS and Android, those bubble up the priority list a lot faster. They're very focused on getting the last few folks migrated from Xamarin over to Maui. If you're more advanced XAML developer and you use control templates to customize your controls in UI, not all Maui controls support that, the templating. Even the button control doesn't support templating. And the performance, it's improving with every release. And with .NET 9, there'll be a huge improvement with the AOT, ahead of time compiling. But with things like interop, the native is always the fastest way to go. Right. Oops. Look at the demo. Collapse that shared project. It's the same thing in every one. So Maui. So the Maui is going to be similar. I didn't use a view model this time. We're back to just having the main page and the code behind. So we're getting our items categories. We've got the same button events and the clear method. So in the XAML, things look a little bit different. Instead of stack panels, we've got vertical stack layout, and then we've got the controls within there that are stacked using picker control instead of a combo box, entry control instead of a text box, and we've got a button. And the list view has an item template. There's no header template here. We're just using an item template for this platform. And let's run this for Windows so we can get a comparison of what the Maui WinUI app looks like. This is still WinUI, but it's styled a little bit different. Maui applies their purple controls and things that they have out of the box. Let's expand this a little bit. So everything, I just stacked everything vertically with that vertical stack control. I'll add some roles to the list. It's popped up at the bottom. And like all the others, check the boxes, delete roles, delete rows, not roles. I can delete roles if I go down here. So everything functions just the same. It looks same kind of styles as WinUI, except the purple. Next up is Blazor Hybrid. So Blazor Hybrid on Windows, or you can do it with mobile with Maui. The pros, there's no XAML learning curve. If you're a web developer, you know Razor Pages, you know C#, you're ready to go. Web developers familiar with CSS, you use that CSS styling instead of the XAML styles. You're building with web using .NET, so your app can consume any other modern .NET libraries that you consume in your web apps. And you can build your hybrid app inside WPF or WinForms, and which makes it easy to integrate with your existing apps on those platforms. So it doesn't have to be a standalone app. It could just be one screen within your other WinForms or WPF app that you had this. So some of the cons, interop has its costs, performance, maybe bugs in the interop layer, maybe issues with accessibility. I've used WebView before and ran into issues trying to get events to fire into the place I wanted them to fire in the web app. Dealing with support across desktop and web products, so you have to worry about bugs in the desktop app and the web app. And it feels like a web app. You know, it's got that bouncy feel sometimes when you're doing web. You can kind of tell when you've got a PWA as compared to a native app. So let's take a quick look at the Blazor Hybrid app, and I'll also show you the documentation for how you can create one yourself. There is a template for creating a .NET Maui Blazor Hybrid app, but they don't have templates for WinForms or WPF yet. There's just a few steps you have to run through to do it yourself. Okay. So Blazor. So this is a WPF project, and we've got a www root in here though, and we've got some Razor files. We've still got our main window.xaml. That's what's going to be the startup page. And on that, we just look at the XAML for that because it's pretty simple. The only control in there is a Blazor web view, and it's loading up the index.html from our www root. And then we're giving it the services. So let's go to the shopping list.razor. Take a look at the Razor page that we're loading up. So it's got a title for the shopping list. It's got some loading stuff for when the items are still loading. And then we've got the same label input for the name, category selector, and a button to add. And then it's using a table with some headers and a for each loop to load each item into the web UI. And then all of our code is pretty similar down here. We've got the add item button. When we load up, we're using the same shopping list helpers to get our items and categories. And that www root. These pages are just imported, and I'll show you the instructions for all this after we give it a quick run. And you'll also see that I'm not a web developer and my CSS skills are not great. So here we can let's do the category first. Add some frozen peas again. That's added there to the bottom. And I was having a heck of a time getting the checkbox to work correctly, so I just added a button to toggle that on and off. And we can delete items too. So let's look at this page here. There it is. So on Microsoft Docs, it's in the ASP.NET Core Docs. There's Build a WPF Blazor app. You just have to make sure you have the desktop and web workloads installed. You're creating a WPF project, and you have to reference the web view for WPF. Tells you to add some things. You have to pull in some files, add in your index HTML. You just copy and paste all this into your project. It just took me 5 or 10 minutes to get all this done, and I had my app up and running. And while I'm on the browser here, I'll show you the links later, but if you go to GitHub, my speaking, Alvin Ashcraft is my GitHub handle. Under speaking, I have all the slides and links and demo projects for all my stuff this year in the 2024 folder. If you go down to the VS Live Redmond one, I've got a page with all the useful links, and then there's folders for the shopping list sample with all these projects and the Uno shopping list that we'll be looking at shortly, and the slide decks here. Okay, Uno platform or Avalonia. So the advantages of some of these third-party solutions like Uno or Avalonia, so you get all the Maui platforms plus Linux plus WebAssembly. So with Uno, you can even use Skia WPF to run on older platforms like Windows 7. So if you're only targeting Windows 10 or later, you'll want to choose the WinUI option for your Windows support. The WinUI Uno project code is nearly identical to WinUI code. I created an Uno app in my book, and all the code I was able to directly copy and paste from my WinUI project. I made the mistake of making the project name differently, so I had different namespaces, so I had to change namespaces when I copy pasted, but that was all. Everything else was exactly the same. You can use C# markup like you can with Uno. So you can have C# for your UI, or you can use XAML. And we'll see the new project wizard here in a little bit too. The project wizard walks you through all that. It asks you if you want to have MVVM or MVU. It'll ask you all kinds of things. They've also got a Figma plugin. So if you've got designers on your team that use Figma, they can design your app screens and then hand them over to you, and you'll have your Uno screens ready to go. Uno can create apps with Microsoft Fluent or Google Materials or the Apple Cupertino UI look and feel. And they've got plugins for Visual Studio, VS Code, or JetBrains Rider. So no matter which IDE you like to use or which platform you're on, you can use one of those. So some drawbacks, no official support for VB or F#. It's a third-party solution. Some companies are sometimes hesitant about going with third parties and may want to just stick with Microsoft and Maui. There are paid options for advanced support. Avalone, I believe, also has some licensing terms for app deployment. And, oops, sorry about that. Like with WinUI and .NET Maui, there's no SAML designer. And you have the same platform-specific code thing you'll have to do when you're going across platforms and you have something that's iOS-specific or Android-specific. You have to do those kinds of things again. And we'll take a quick look at the Uno version of the shopping list app. I have this in a separate solution because you have to have a single solution for your Uno app. It doesn't let you add it to an existing one. So let's stop this. And Uno. So this is the Uno solution, my Uno shopping list. So I've got the main page.xaml, and I have a view model. All this was existing, except I added the models in here, the item, the category, and the helpers class. So in the main page code behind, the only thing here is creating the view model and the delete button, just like we had in the WinUI project. View model, it also uses the same MVVM method with observable object. So this is all the same as the WinUI code. And we will, let's see, let's take a chance and try running this in WebAssembly. This may take just a second to load up. This is going to create the WebAssembly output and open it up in the browser for us, and it should work just the same as the desktop apps. Okay, progress. Just loading up Edge. It's probably deploying binary in the background. There's our Uno splash screen. And the issue with WebAssembly is the load times. You have to load the whole runtime into the browser along with your app. And there it is. Looks like our WinUI app, but it's running in the browser. And it should function about the same. See if we have roles. We have roles now. And the checkboxes work. And let's see if this has the bug where it's deleting the wrong item. Nope, this one works. That's like if I hit the reload button on here now. Let's see what that does. So it went right to the splash screen. That's a good sign. It's still pretty slow though. Yeah, not super fast. Sure. Stop that. And where's my Windows? Let's go to Config Manager, maybe? No. It's odd. All the configure projects, maybe? No, it's just that project. Is that there? Oh, yeah. Yeah, let's do packaged. Thank you. Oh, build errors. No. What are the errors? No, it doesn't. Just needed a moment. There we go. So it looks like the WinUI. Oops, PDs. And the delete's working correctly here too. And we're a little short on time, but so I won't show the Android, but you can run Android from here too. I've done it in the past where I don't know if any of you have used there's a Windows subsystem for Linux, but there's also a Windows subsystem for Android, which has been deprecated, but it's still working, I think, until next March or April. So you can actually have the Android subsystem running on your computer. And when you run an Android app in Visual Studio with that, you get a nice resizable window so you can test your different sizes and things without having to pick different emulators. All right, so let's go back. All right, so choosing a UI framework. There's a lot of things to consider. Top recommendations today from Microsoft are WPF and WinUI for doing native Windows apps. For cross-platform.NET, you'll typically want to go with .NET MAUI. For reasons to use WPF versus WinUI, there's a good session from Microsoft Build called Navigating WinUI or Win32 App Development with WinUI and WPF. I've got a link to it on my repo on that links page. So they go through a lot of detail. These are two of the images from their slide deck. Some of the benefits of each WinUI and WPF with .NET 9. So some of the other things to consider, the programming languages your team likes to use. If they're C++ and they want to do native Windows, you're probably going to go with WinUI that supports C++. Does your team have experience with existing UI framework? Do they know XAML? Are they comfortable with XAML? Do you need a UI designer? Fluent design, that Windows modern design, how important is that to you and your app? You want to work with .NET, maybe you want to, you've got developers that know Flutter or React Native or something. They want to go with those things. Do you need to support older Windows versions that maybe Microsoft doesn't support, but you've still got apps running out there? Are you integrating with existing apps? Do you need cross-platform? Are you going to be Windows only forever? Are you porting an existing solution? How long do you expect to support your app? The touch support. Look at the public roadmap for all the different options. See if something's missing currently. Is it coming soon? And what does Microsoft recommend? Well, Maui, WPF, WinUI are the big three. And I really recommend watching that build session to see a lot of details on the differences between the WPF and the WinUI recommendations from them. Yeah, there are pages for the .NET upgrade tool on upgrading WinForms and WPF. If you go on Microsoft Learn and search for WPF upgrade, you should be able to find some help on that. I think most of your issues are going to be with maybe controls and other libraries that you're using that are .NET Framework. There may be .NET versions out there that are used for it, but the upgrade assistant might not know what they are, so it'll flag those as errors. Sure. So these are some links. I've got more up on my GitHub repo. If you want to snap a picture of this, or if not, just go to Alvin Ashcraft on GitHub and go to my speaking repo. I've got this slide deck out there along with all those other links on the links markdown page. Yeah. If you don't want it to be to the public, through the Microsoft Store, I think a lot of enterprises today are using Intune for deployment. You can still do other, installers. You can build your own MSI X, or you can do, all the advanced installer has a install solution to some third parties. Oops. And so any other questions? The contact is up there. And so this week I'm going to be at the welcome reception tonight at a Microsoft Learn table. And also on Thursday, there's the Meet the VS and .NET Teams reception. I'll also be there at a Microsoft Learn table. And I've got 2 copies of my book at each one to give away. I'm not sure the criteria yet. Maybe if you ask a good question, I'll give you a free book. And I'll be at the Table Topics lunch tomorrow. Yes.
So in terms of accessibility, the web does have a lot of guidelines, a lot of tools.
Right.
And in between these frameworks, are some that definitely have more advanced guidelines on accessibility or even more tooling?
So I know that WinUI has a lot of accessibility guidelines. There's a whole section in the docs about the accessibility and how that's integrated with the framework. I would think that in WPF and WinForms are both very mature, so the accessibility in those is pretty mature as well. I'm not sure if there are published guidelines for those, but if they would be in their docs too, if they do have them. I don't think there's a standard set across all the frameworks. And I think Maui probably has the biggest way to go as far as accessibility, since it's the newest framework and they have to support all those cross-platform options. I didn't create one, but that's something I could create and throw up in the repo to go with the others. What's that? I'm sorry? The Microsoft Foundation classes. Yeah, I haven't created that either, but that's something else that I could put up on the sample in the repo. It's not in my book now. Okay, it's .NET and C# only in my book. Sure. All right. Anything else? I think we're out of time anyway, so thanks. If you have any other questions, come meet me at the receptions.